I moved my mother into assisted living and rented out the house my sister and I bought for her. Now my sister says I betrayed the family, hired a lawyer, turned half our relatives against me, and made sure everyone in San Antonio knows my name like I committed some kind of crime. Maybe by the end of this, you will think she is right. But I need people to understand something before they judge me. Nobody wants to be the daughter who makes the hard call. Everybody wants to be the daughter who cries in the kitchen, says family comes first, and gets praised for loving her mother the loudest. Nobody wants to be the one who looks at the numbers, the warning signs, the things nobody wants to say out loud, and says, "This cannot keep going." My sister thinks I stole our mother's home. I think I stopped all of us from waiting around for the day something happened that none of us could undo. And yes, I made the decision without asking her first. That is the part everyone keeps coming back to. For context, I am 41 years old, married, and I live in Cedar Park with my husband, Daniel, and our 2 kids, Leo and Sophia. I work as a senior business analyst for a healthcare software company. I make good money, at least by the standards I grew up with. Daniel works in enterprise sales. Between the 2 of us, we have built the kind of life my mother used to call a safe. A 4-bedroom house. Good schools. A fridge that is always full. A savings account that does not disappear every time the car needs tires. That matters, because I did not grow up in safety. My sister likes to act like I only see life through spreadsheets and monthly budgets, but when you grow up watching your mother choose between rent and groceries, numbers stop feeling cold. They start feeling like the only thing standing between you and chaos. My sister, Lucia, is 36. She lives in San Antonio with her son, Mateo. She works in healthcare, makes less than I do, and has done much more of the hands-on care for our mother these last few years. I am not pretending otherwise. She was the one driving across town, picking up prescriptions, fixing loose cabinet hinges, dropping by on Thursdays just to sit with our mother and watch TV. I know what that looks like from the outside. It looks like love. And maybe it is. But love is easier to recognize when it is visible. When it is physical. When people can point to it. I was carrying the future. And somewhere along the way, I started to feel like being the daughter who worried about the future made me look like the daughter who cared less. My mother, Teresa, spent most of her life wanting things she never once asked for out loud. She never talked about wanting a bigger life. She never sat us down and said she wished for more. But when I was a kid, I used to notice the way she looked at certain houses. Not the huge ones. Not anything flashy. Just small homes with front porches, flower beds, warm kitchen lights, the kind of place that looked settled. The kind of place where nobody had to move because the rent went up. The kind of place where the walls belonged to you, where you could hang a picture without asking permission, where the couch stayed in the same corner for 10 years because no landlord could tell you otherwise. That was her dream. A home that stayed. And the truth is, she could have chased it earlier if she had lived for herself. She just never did. Everything my mother had went into me and Lucia. Every overtime shift. Every worn-out pair of shoes she kept 1 year too long. Every Christmas where she somehow made things feel full even when I know now there was barely enough money to carry us through January. She was the kind of woman who would say she was not hungry so her daughters could have the last 2 tortillas. The kind who learned how to stretch 1 chicken into 3 meals and still made dinner feel like love. She did not postpone her life because she was weak. She did it because loving us was the organizing principle of her entire existence. College fees. School clothes. Gas money. Braces. Field trips. Emergencies. The little humiliations of growing up poor that she tried to erase before they ever reached us. My mother absorbed all of it like that was simply what mothers did. She never made us feel like a burden. That is the part that stays with me most. She gave and gave with such grace that we almost missed the size of the sacrifice. By the time Lucia and I were adults, I understood what it had cost her. So when we finally bought that house for her, it did not feel like charity. It felt like a debt neither of us could ever fully repay. Lucia and I split the down payment equally. We put both our names on everything. And when we handed our mother the keys, she stood there in the living room with this expression I still cannot describe without feeling it in my chest. Not shock. Not disbelief. Recognition. Like some part of her had been waiting her whole life to step into a home that was finally allowed to be hers. The house was on Valencia Street, less than 15 minutes from Lucia's apartment. At the time, that felt practical. She was already the one living in San Antonio. She knew the streets, the clinics, the grocery stores my mother liked, which pharmacy filled her prescriptions fastest, which neighbor would notice if something looked off. I was in Cedar Park, juggling my own children, school schedules, work calls that bled past dinner, and a marriage that functioned only because our lives ran on planning. So when we chose a place for Mom, it made sense to choose one near Lucia. And to Lucia's credit, she stepped into that role completely. She was there all the time. She stopped by after work with groceries. She brought Matteo over on weekends. She sat with our mother in the kitchen while dinner simmered and listened to the same stories I had heard all my life as if they were still new. She remembered which tea Mom liked when she could not sleep, which blanket she reached for during movies, how she wanted the Virgin Mary portrait hung in the living room at exactly the right height. Lucia noticed things. The small things. The living things. She did not love our mother in theory. She loved her in practice. I saw that. I want that on the record. When I visited, the house already had a rhythm I had not helped create. Matteo's backpack by the chair. My mother's sandals by the door. Lucia moving around the kitchen like she had always belonged there, opening cabinets without thinking, adjusting the flame under a pot, wiping down the counter while Mom talked. Nothing about it was performative. That was what made it hard to resent. It was real. And the harder truth is that I did resent it sometimes. Not Lucia herself, not exactly. More the quiet, humiliating realization that love looks holier when people can watch it happen. I was paying my share. I was answering calls. I was thinking years ahead about maintenance, insurance, property taxes, long-term care, all the unromantic things that keep a life from collapsing. But none of that glowed the way Lucia did standing at the sink beside our mother, both of them laughing over something I had walked in too late to understand. There were afternoons when I would stand in that house and feel split in two. One part of me was proud beyond words. Proud that our mother had a garden now. Proud that she had her own walls, her own porch, her own kitchen. Proud that Lucia had given her something I could not give from an hour and a half away, which was presence. The other part of me felt like I was slowly becoming a visitor in a house I helped buy. That feeling shamed me, because it sounded selfish even inside my own head. Lucia was doing the work. My mother was happy. Nothing was wrong. If anything, I should have felt grateful. Instead, I kept noticing how easily the two of them fit into each other's daily lives without me. I would drive back to Cedar Park with that feeling sitting heavy in my chest, telling myself it did not matter who was closest as long as her mother was loved. I believed that. I also think that was the first time I understood how possible it was to be essential on paper and peripheral in real life. Nothing dramatic happened for a long time. That is probably why the one bad afternoon lodged itself in my mind the way it did. It was late August, brutally hot, the kind of Texas heat that makes the air feel metallic. Mom had spent part of the morning in the backyard, not doing anything reckless, just clipping dead leaves and fussing over the herbs like she always did. Lucia stopped by after work with Matteo, mostly because she had promised to bring over soup and a new battery for the kitchen clock. She found Mom sitting at the table, pale, damp with sweat, saying she was fine in that clipped little voice she used when she clearly was not. Lucia called me from the car on the way to urgent care. Mom was stable. It turned out to be dehydration and a blood pressure dip, nothing catastrophic, nothing with a dramatic diagnosis attached to it. She was treated, monitored, sent home the same night with instructions, electrolytes, and the kind of warning that sounds casual until you replay it later. Watch her closely. Make sure she's drinking enough. At her age, things can escalate faster than people expect. Lucia handled it. Of course she did. She got Mom into the car, answered the nurse's questions, brought her home, stayed until she had eaten something light, then texted me an update like this was just one more thing added to the long list of things she knew how to do without needing anyone's permission. I said all the correct things. Thank you. I'm glad you got there when you did. Keep me posted. Then I sat on the edge of my bed in Cedar Park and let my mind start building disasters. If Lucia had not stopped by. If that had happened 2 hours later. If Mom had gone outside again after dark. If her phone had been in the other room. If she had decided not to mention feeling dizzy because she did not want to worry anyone. If a nothing serious, it became serious in the amount of time it takes for a body to be alone. That was how it started for me. Not panic exactly. Something slower. More corrosive. I began to think in branching parts. In outcomes. In timelines where one small thing tipped and everything after it became irreversible. And mixed in with that, which I am not proud of, was something meaner and harder to name. Lucia got to be the one who was there. She got the phone calls, the look on Mom's face when she opened the door, the chance to step in first, to be useful in the exact moment usefulness was needed. She got to convert love into action over and over again, in ways that could be seen, remembered, measured in immediate relief. I had money, planning, distance, and a car ride too long to matter in emergencies. I never said any of this out loud because even thinking it made me feel small. Lucia had earned that place in Mom's daily life. I knew that. She showed up. I did not in the same way. But after that day, every time my phone rang at the wrong hour, I felt the same cold thought move through me. One day Lucia will not get there in time, and I will have built my whole idea of responsibility around arriving after the worst part is already over. After that, I started doing what I always do when I feel something slipping beyond my control. I researched. Not in some frantic, melodramatic way. Quietly. Late at night after the kids were asleep, with my laptop open and the house finally still. I looked up in home care rates in San Antonio. Assisted living costs. Medication support. Meal services. Emergency response systems. What happens when an older parent is still mostly independent until the day they suddenly are not? What families do when one sibling lives close enough to manage the daily texture of care and the other does not? Daniel noticed before I said anything. He would walk past the dining table, glance at the tabs open on my screen, and ask, "Are you trying to figure out the long-term plan?" Not whether there needed to be one. Just what it was. That was part of why talking to him felt easier than talking to Lucia. He did not get pulled into the emotion of things first. He went straight to structure. To sustainability. To the question underneath the question. If this cannot rely forever on one person dropping by after work, then what is the actual plan? I kept circling the same facts. Lucia was present. Yes. But presence is not the same as a system. Love is not a system either, no matter how much people want it to be. A good week proves nothing. One lucky outcome proves even less. We had a mother getting older in a house that depended heavily on Lucia being nearby and available, and I had begun to suspect that all of us were treating that arrangement like it was permanent simply because it was emotionally comforting. That thought did not make me feel relieved. It made me feel calculating. I knew how it sounded, even inside my own head. I knew how ugly it was to sit there comparing costs, weighing options, looking at the Valencia Street house not just as the place where my mother kept her garden gloves and her good serving bowls, but also as a property with value attached to it. I hated the language my mind kept reaching for. Equity. Monthly offset. Coverage. Feasible. Sustainable. But the uglier truth was that I did not stop. Because once I had started thinking in terms of long-term care, the house became impossible to ignore. It was there. It existed. It had value. And pretending otherwise started to feel, to me, less loving than irresponsible. If Mom needed more support over time, that support would cost money. Real money. More than electrolyte drinks and a neighbor checking in. More than good intentions. I told myself I was not reducing her life to numbers. I told myself I was trying to protect it before circumstances forced all of us into a worse decision later, one made in an ER waiting room or after a midnight phone call none of us were ready for. And under all of that, buried where I did not want to examine it too closely, was something else. Lucia got to be the daughter who was needed now. I was starting to build myself into the daughter who would be needed later. There is a kind of selfishness in that, even if it hides inside responsibility. I knew it then. I know it now. I did not wake up one morning and decide to become the kind of person who makes a family decision in secret. It happened the way bad decisions usually happen for people like me, incrementally, then all at once. I started by telling myself I was only gathering information. I toured Silver Pines on a weekday when I already had meetings in San Antonio. I asked questions I framed as hypothetical. Staffing. Meal plans. Medication reminders. What they did when residents were still mostly independent, but needed more eyes on them than family could realistically provide. I remember how calm the place felt. Clean. Predictable. Structured. Everything had a schedule. Everything had a procedure. Nothing depended on whether someone got stuck in traffic or had a sick child or an impossible week at work. That kind of order can look a lot like mercy when you are scared enough. The lease came later. I found the listing agent for a small rental property nearby and asked what a house like Mom's could bring in. Then I ran the numbers the way I knew Lucia never would, because she hated what numbers did to anything human. Rent against care. Maintenance against supervision. Long-term cost against short-term comfort. I kept arriving at the same conclusion and feeling worse every time I did. By then I already knew Lucia would never agree if I brought it to her as a discussion. Not because she was stupid. Because she loved Mom in the language of daily life, and what I was proposing belonged to another language entirely. So I told myself a version of the truth that made it easier to proceed. If I asked first, we would fight for months. If I acted first, everyone would be furious, but at least there would be a plan. I said yes to Silver Pines before I said anything to my sister. I signed the lease on Valencia Street as co-owner and property manager. Even writing that now, I can feel the shape of the line I crossed. At the time, I called it decisiveness. Lucia called me that night from the parking lot at Silver Pines. I knew where she was before she said a word. I could hear it in the silence on her end, that dangerous kind of silence that means someone is no longer confused, only devastated. What did you do? She asked. There are questions that are really accusations. That was one of them. I told her Mom needed more support. I told her Silver Pines had staff, structure, meals, medication oversight, people who could respond immediately if something went wrong. I told her renting out the house would cover part of the cost and give us a plan instead of forcing us to improvise every time life reminded us that our mother was getting older whether we were emotionally ready for it or not. Lucia listened until I finished. Then she said, You took her out of her home without telling me. You moved her like she was a problem to solve. That was the point where the conversation stopped being about logistics and became what it was always going to be about. Two different ideas of love colliding hard enough to sound like betrayal. Lucier's love made sense from every angle. That was the power of it. From Mom's angle, it was comfort. From Mateo's angle, it was family. From the neighbor's angle, it was devotion. From the outside, Lucia looked exactly like what a good daughter is supposed to look like. She was present, visible, warm. Her love translated cleanly no matter who was watching. Nobody needed context to understand it. Nobody needed a spreadsheet, or a timeline, or a fear they kept hidden in the middle of the night. They could just look at her and know. My love was not like that. Mine only made sense from the angles nobody else could stand in. From the angle of distance. From the angle of dread. From the angle of imagining the call that comes too late, the emergency that turns one ordinary day into a before and after. From the angle of knowing that stability costs money and that aging does not pause because a family is sentimental. From the angle of being the daughter who did not get to prove her love through nearness, only through decisions that looked cold once they were dragged into the light. That does not make Lucia wrong. It also does not make me heartless. That was what I tried, badly, to say. I told her she was seeing tonight, and I was seeing the next 5 years. I told her she was defending the life Mom wanted, and I was trying to prepare for the life Mom might eventually need. I told her those were not the same thing, and pretending they were the same was its own kind of cruelty. She said, "You don't get to call this love after putting her in that room." And maybe from where she stood, she was right. That is the unbearable part. We were both telling the truth. Just not a truth that could survive inside the same house. Lucia loved our mother in a way the whole world could witness and bless. I loved her in a way that only makes sense if you already know the fear behind it. And fear, when spoken out loud, almost never sounds like love. The demand letter arrived 2 weeks later. I read it alone at my kitchen counter while Daniel was upstairs helping Leo with homework and Sophia was in the living room arguing with a cartoon. The language was precise, clinical, expensive. Unauthorized lease. Co-owned property. Removal without consent. Potential legal action. Immediate demand for correction. I was angry when I finished it. Not shocked. Not morally offended. Just angry in the blunt, physical way people get when something they knew might happen finally takes shape in writing. Because by then I understood exactly how this looked. Not complicated. Not nuanced. Not a difficult decision made under pressure. It looked like a woman with a better salary and a cleaner house had taken her mother out of the home she loved, rented that home for money, and failed to tell the one person who had been there day after day. There is no version of that story that sounds kind when said out loud. There probably should not be. Within 48 hours, Aunt Carmen had called. Then 2 cousins. Then Daniel started getting tense, not because he thought Lucia was right in every particular, but because once lawyers get involved, intent stops mattering as much as documentation does. The tenants called twice, then a third time. Lucia had talked to family. Family had talked to more family. Everyone had an opinion, and almost all of them formed around the same shape. Greedy. Cold. Ungrateful. Practical in the ugliest possible way. I did not spend that week telling myself they were unfair. I knew why the story settled there. People believe what the evidence lets them believe. And the evidence, as seen from the outside, was brutal. Lucia had years of visible care behind her. I had a unilateral decision, a signed lease, and a mother now sleeping in a room she had not chosen. Whatever fears had driven me there were still mostly inside me, unseen, unverifiable, impossible to lay next to the facts and expect them to outweigh what I had actually done. That was the part one kept turning over. Not whether my intentions were pure. Intentions are private. Outcomes are public. Publicly, I had taken a woman from the first home she had ever loved and converted that home into a line item. Publicly, Lucia was the daughter trying to return meaning to what I had turned into management. And if I am honest, there was a grim logic to everyone choosing her side. Lucia's version required no footnotes. Mine required access to thoughts I had never shared honestly, not even with myself all the way through. So I stopped asking whether I was being misunderstood and started asking a harder question. What if the problem was not that people had simplified what I did? What if what I did had, by its nature, stripped away the right to ask for a generous interpretation? That thought did not absolve Lucia of anything, and it did not make me surrender my whole argument. But it did something worse. It made me begin to see that there are decisions which feel defensible while you are making them and look indefensible the moment other people have to live inside their consequences. I went to see Mum 3 days after the demand letter came. Not because I suddenly became brave. Mostly because there is only so long you can keep defending a decision in theory before you have to stand inside what it has actually created. Silver Pines looked exactly the way I had remembered it from the tour. The lobby smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and brewed coffee. The front desk was staffed. The floors were polished. A television murmured from a common room where 2 women sat side by side without speaking, both staring at the same afternoon game show with the flat concentration of people filling time rather than enjoying it. Nothing was chaotic. Nothing was dirty. Nothing was neglectful. If you wanted proof that I had not sent my mother somewhere cruel, it was all there in plain sight. That was the problem. Everything that had reassured me the first time now felt almost accusatory in its orderliness. The place was functioning exactly as designed. It was my mother inside it that made the design feel wrong. She was in her room, sitting on the edge of the bed, folding and unfolding a hand towel in her lap. Her roommate was asleep behind the privacy curtain. Mum looked up when I stepped in, and for one brief second I saw something roar pass across her face before she arranged it into composure. That hurt more than if she had started crying. When she was younger, my mother had always absorbed discomfort before it could reach anyone else. Hunger, exhaustion, humiliation, disappointment. She had a way of tucking it into herself so neatly that by the time the rest of us noticed anything was wrong, she had already turned it into endurance. That was the expression she had on now. Not panic. Not outrage. Endurance. I asked how she was settling in. She said, "It's fine." I asked if the staff were kind. She said, They are." I asked if she liked the meals. She gave me the smallest pause before saying, They try." The room was clean. The bed was made. Her medications were lined up properly. A cardigan hung from the wardrobe door. On paper, everything was acceptable. More than acceptable, really. Safe. Managed. Predictable. I had wanted all of those things for her. I had built my case around them. Then she asked me if Lucia had been by. Not accusingly. Not even pointedly. Just quietly, the way someone asks after the rhythm of their real life when they have been removed from it. I said yes. She nodded and looked down at the towel in her hands. "Tell her I'm all right," she said. That should have relieved me. Instead it landed with a weight I did not know what to do with. Because I could hear what she was doing. She was trying to make this easier on me. She was protecting me from the full force of her unhappiness the same way she had protected us from everything else our whole lives. I sat there for maybe 20 minutes talking about ordinary things. The kids. The weather. A woman from church who had apparently called twice. I asked whether she was joining activities. She said maybe. I asked whether she had made friends. She smiled in that polite, impossible way and said everyone was very nice. Then I made the mistake of asking whether she needed me to bring anything from the house. She looked at me for a long time before answering. My rosary is here, she said. Most of what I need is here. It was such a careful sentence that I almost missed what lived inside it. Not what I need. Most of what I need. As if the remainder was too large, too personal, or too hopeless to name. I drove back to Cedar Park with that sentence sitting in the car beside me like another passenger. For months I had told myself I was acting out of foresight. That I was willing to endure being disliked if it meant preventing something worse later. That good daughters do not always look good in the middle of hard choices. Some of that still felt true, or at least not entirely false. But this was the first time I let in another possibility. That a decision can be rational, structured, financially defensible, and still violate something essential. That safety, by itself, is not a complete moral argument. That a room can meet every requirement on paper and still feel like an exile to the person living in it. I did not leave Silver Pines thinking Lucia had been right about everything. I left understanding something more dangerous than that. She had not been wrong about the part that mattered most. The detail that finally stripped all the abstraction out of what I had done was not Silver Pines. It was the rent. Until then, I had still been able to narrate my choices to myself in terms that sounded structured, if not noble. Care plan. Cost offset. Long-term sustainability. Even after seeing Mum there, even after hearing the careful emptiness in her voice, some part of me was still arranging the situation into categories I could tolerate. Then Miguel Salazar's second letter arrived. This one was sharper. Less interested in broad arguments, more interested in facts. It requested an accounting of the lease proceeds and asked where, specifically, the rent had been deposited since the tenants moved in. It asked whether those funds had been placed into a shared account for Teresa's care, whether Lucia had been notified of their receipt, and whether I had documented any of it for the other co-owner of the property. I stood at my desk and read that paragraph 3 times. Because the money had gone into my account. Not because I had thought of it as mine. Not exactly. I had told myself it was temporary, administrative, efficient. The invoices for Silver Pines came to me. I was the one coordinating. I was the one keeping the amounts straight. Putting the rent into my own account had felt, at the time, like the kind of practical shortcut busy adults make every day when the intention is clean and the bookkeeping can be sorted later. Deposited into an account controlled solely by me. No shared access. No accounting delivered. When I saw it written that way, I heard for the first time how much control I had taken without ever saying the word control out loud. Not just over the house. Over the information. Over the money. Over the pace of events. Over what Lucia was allowed to know after decisions were already irreversible. I had been calling all of that management because management sounds temporary and reasonable. Control sounds like what it was becoming. I remember sitting down at the edge of the bed that night and understanding, with a clarity I had managed to avoid until then, that the ugliest interpretation of my actions no longer depended on anyone being unfair. I had not done one bad thing. I had built a chain. Move Mom. Lease the house. Collect the rent. Hold the account. Explain later. Even if every link had been justified to myself one by one, the full shape of it was something else. Something I could no longer look at and honestly call only practical. The mediation was scheduled for the following month, but Lucia's side pushed to move it up. By then the tenants had already made it clear they wanted out. They had not signed up to become evidence in somebody else's family collapse, and I could not blame them for that. Once they gave notice, the numbers I had leaned on so heavily started falling apart in real time. Silver Pines was still billing. The house was no longer a stable offset. Daniel stopped talking about the plan and started talking about exposure, liability, what this would cost us if it dragged any further. I heard him. I did. But by that point, money had stopped being the center of the story in my own head. What I was really carrying into mediation was not confidence exactly. Not even a clean defense. More like the residue of one. The last stubborn pieces of the person who still wanted to believe that making an orderly decision could excuse the violence of making it alone. Judge Elena Romero ran the session. Retired family court judge, immaculate posture, no patience for dramatics. Lucia came with Miguel Salazar. I came with Daniel and my attorney from Austin. We all sat in one conference room under lighting too bright for the kind of truths people end up saying in places like that. Lucia looked tired. Not performatively devastated. Not theatrical. Just worn down in a way that was harder to dismiss because it suggested duration, not spectacle. She barely looked at me. I noticed that more than I wanted to. My attorney started where I expected her to start. Co-owner discretion, concern for Teresa's future needs, a reasonable if imperfect response to a growing care issue. Clean language. Defensible language. The kind that lifts a decision slightly off the ground so nobody has to stare directly at the damage underneath it. Miguel did not raise his voice once. He just laid things out. The unilateral transfer. The lease executed without Lucia's consent. The rental proceeds deposited into an account I controlled alone. The absence of any written caregiving plan agreed to by both owners. The fact that Teresa had not wanted to leave her home. The fact that alternatives between a do-nothing and a remove her entirely had never been properly explored. I kept waiting for my anger to rise. For that familiar internal argument to reassemble itself and remind me why I had done what I had done. Instead, something quieter happened. Every time he named one piece, it sounded less like a difficult choice and more like a narrowing of options I had imposed on everyone else. Judge Romero asked me directly why I had not informed Lucia before signing the lease. I could have said what I had been saying for weeks. That Lucia would have blocked it. That delay would have made planning harder. That someone needed to act. All of that was true, in the narrow sense. But truth has gradations, and I was tired of hiding inside the thinnest one. So I said it because I knew she would never agree, and I believed that if I acted first, I would control the outcome. The room went very still after that. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was plain. Control the outcome. There it was. Cleaner than all the phrases I had used before. Cleaner and uglier. Lucia closed her eyes for a second when I said it. Daniel shifted beside me, subtle but not subtle enough. My attorney wrote something down and did not look up. Judge Romero asked whether my mother had been unsafe in the home at that time. I answered honestly. Not unsafe enough to justify doing it the way I did. That was the first sentence I had spoken in weeks that felt fully undivided. After that, the agreement came together faster than I expected. The tenants would leave as planned. Mom would return to the Valencia Street house. Neither Lucia nor I could lease, sell, encumber, or materially change the use of the property without the other's written consent. The rent already collected would go into a joint account designated only for Mom's care and the house. I would cover the first 3 months of part-time in-home support. We would create an actual care plan instead of improvising one around resentment and distance. I signed. Not because Lucia had won and I had lost. That was too childish a way to understand what had happened. I signed because for the first time I could see the full outline of what I had done without needing to argue with the edges of it. I had wanted to protect my mother from uncertainty. Instead, I had made myself the instrument of her displacement. And no amount of structure, once I saw that clearly, was going to make me noble for it. Mom went home on a Saturday. I drove down from Cedar Park alone. Daniel stayed back with the kids, which was probably for the best. By then there was nothing left to strategize, nothing left to calculate, nothing left to defend without sounding ridiculous. All that remained was the physical reality of undoing what I had done and standing still long enough to watch it happen. Mrs. Navarro was outside when I pulled up, sitting on her porch in the kind of early afternoon light that makes everything look almost staged. She had made a sign on white poster board that said "Welcome Home," Teresa in thick and even blue letters. It was sweet in the way neighborhood gestures usually are, but it also hit me harder than I expected. There are moments when community feels like comfort. There are others when it feels like a verdict delivered gently. Lucier's car was already there. Mom was standing just inside the doorway when I walked in, one hand on the frame like she needed to steady herself against the fact of being back. The Virgin Mary portrait had been rehung in the living room. Matteo was carrying in one of Mom's bags with the solemn concentration children have when they know something important is happening but do not fully understand why. Lucia was in the kitchen, moving carefully, putting things back where they belonged. I stayed near the entry for a second longer than I should have. No one told me to. No one had to. There are spaces you can feel yourself no longer having the right to enter casually. Mom hugged me first. That was my mother all over. She made mercy look instinctive. She held me for only a few seconds, but long enough for me to feel how small I had made my understanding of her these past months. I had been so focused on risk, structure, outcomes, sustainability, that I had reduced her life to what could be managed. I had accounted for cost, but not for meaning. I had accounted for supervision, but not for belonging. Then she went to the backyard. The garden was mostly gone. Dry stems, brittle soil, a few stubborn green things hanging on near the edge where the shade lasted longest. I stood a little behind her and watched her take it in. This, more than anything, was the scene I had avoided imagining honestly. Not the paperwork. Not the mediation. Not Lucier's anger. This. My mother looking at the afterimage of something living that had depended on being tended. After a while she said, softly, "I will start again." Not I'll. We'll. That was the sentence that finished the work Silver Pines had begun in me. Because it contained no performance, no argument, no punishment. Just a return to the kind of love my mother had always practiced, the kind that keeps making room even after it has been wounded. Lucia came outside then. She stood on Mom's other side, close enough that their shadows touched. For a second I saw us as if from somewhere above it all, two daughters who had both loved the same woman truthfully, and one daughter who had let fear disguise itself as wisdom until it became a form of exile. I turned to Lucia before I could lose the nerve. "I was trying to help," I said. The words sounded smaller out there than they had in my head all those weeks. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "I know you believe that." It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. It was something harder to live with and probably more honest, the recognition that good intentions do not erase certain kinds of harm, especially when those intentions are carried out through control. I did not argue with her. I could not. Because by then I understood the difference between loving someone enough to protect them and loving someone so anxiously that you begin rearranging their life around your fear. I do not think I ever stopped loving my mother. What I did do was let that love become so filtered through distance, guilt, pride, and the need to be right that I stopped recognizing the shape it had taken. I thought I was preventing a future crisis. Instead, I became one.